After reading this module, you will be able to understand the value of aligning a resource allocation to the strategy and also know the factors that influence the resource allocation. The dynamic and ever-changing global environment poses many challenges for an organization. A successful organization scans and analyzes the external environment for opportunities and threats to develop a competitive advantage. Environmental scanning provides with the necessary knowledge to compete efficiently in the marketplace. Scanning of the internal environment is also crucial as it helps in identification of the company's strengths and weaknesses to be able to grab the opportunities present in the market as well as overcome the threats. Scanning the internal environment requires identification and development of organizations' key resources and competencies. One of the biggest challenge is to use the resources of the company effectively. A firm should know where to use the available resources. To be successful, a strategic plan has to be devised to allocate resources in the most effective manner. Resources are an organization's assets and are thus the building blocks of the organization. Resources create competencies for the organization. Resources are valuable when they enable a company to create a strong demand for its products and lower the cost of production. They include tangible assets such as the plant, equipment, finances and location, human assets in terms of the number of employees, their skills and motivation, and the intangible assets such as its technology, patents and copyrights, culture and reputation. We shall now discuss the types of resources. Broadly, there are 4 types of resources, namely the financial resources such as capital, physical resources such as assets, the human resources such as skills, competencies, and the technological resources such as sophisticated information technology. Physical resources are the backbone of an organization. Physical resources include land, machine, equipment, building, furniture, etc. An organization needs adequate infrastructure to function effectively. Financial resources are the lifeline of an organization. An organization will need money to maintain adequate working and fixed capital. Effective management of the financial resources is necessary for smooth functioning of business. Human resources. Employees are the assets of an organization. The survival and success of any organization depends upon the quality of human resources. In such a global scenario, where human resources provide a competitive advantage to the organization, scanning of the internal environment can provide insight about the strengths and weaknesses of the human resources and how to use them effectively. Technological resources. Technology is fast becoming an important asset for an organization. Technological resources are the intangible resources, and these include the patents, copyrights, skills, intellectual property, etc. An organization is required to upgrade and protect its technology in order to stay competitive. If used properly, resources can be served as strengths to carry out the value-added services. Now, we shall throw some light on the process of resource allocation. Resource allocation process is basically the process and strategy involving a company deciding where the scarce resources should be used in the production of goods and services. A resource can be considered as any factor of production which is something used to produce goods or services. Resource allocation deals with the procurement, commitment and distribution of the financial and human and physical resources to the strategic tasks for the achievement of the organizational objectives. It is both one-time and a continuous process. When a new project is implemented, it requires allocation of resources, whereas an existing project will require the resources to be allocated. Resource allocation process helps to understand how organizations decide to commit their resources, the factors that impact such decisions, and the strategic outcome of the commitments made. Resource allocation process acts like a filter that determines which initiatives of an organization will get approved or rejected. Resources are allocated to products, processes, and services, and a company's strategy is demonstrated through them. Therefore, only those strategies will be accepted which will pass through the resource allocation process. Resource allocation process is a complex and a scattered process that occurs at every stage of decision making by the organization. Top management, on the basis of the available company's resources, decides which projects and capital investments have to be made and which ones have to be rejected. A company, through the capital budgeting process, accepts only those projects with the available resources, that is capital, which can generate higher return on the investment. Now let's try to understand the process of aligning resources to the strategy. Strategy is a way in which a firm works hard to differentiate itself positively from its competitors, using its strengths to better satisfy its customers' needs. Strategic management is a set of managerial decisions and actions that determines the long-run performance of the organization. Strategic management enables the resources to be allocated according to the priorities established by annual objectives set by the organization. Resource allocation begins at the strategic planning, when the company sets its vision and goals for the future. The strategic goals of the company are fulfilled through the achievement of the objectives. For example, a FMCG company's goal is to become a market leader in the rural market. The objective towards this goal is promotion of the company's product according to the needs of the rural customer. After setting up of the objectives, the next step is to allocate sufficient resources to achieve this objective. In the example given, the company will allocate money for the market research to decide the need for the rural consumers, money for promotional activities such as advertising, and funds for product design. The real value of any resource allocation plan lies in the resulting attainment of the firm's objectives. Using resources to gain competitive advantage. Resources are the key to the company's sustained competitive advantage. Grant has proposed a 5-step resource-based approach to strategic analysis. First is identification and classification of a firm's resources in terms of strengths and weaknesses. Combine with the firm's strengths into specific capabilities and core competencies. Estimate value of the profit potential of these specific capabilities and the core competencies in terms of their prospects for sustainable competitive advantage and the potential to yield the profits resulting from their use. Are there any distinctive competencies? Choose the strategy that best exploits the firm's capabilities and competencies relative to the external opportunities. The 5th stage is to identify the resource gaps, if any, and invest in upgrading the weaknesses. It is imperative to evaluate the importance of a company's resources to check whether they are the internal strategic factors, that is strengths and weaknesses that will help determine the future of the company. This can be done by comparing measures of resource endowments with the measures of company's past performance, the company's key competitors, and the industry as a whole. Any resource such as A firm's cash situation, asset, and patent is likely to be a strategic factor and should be considered as its strategic decision if the resource is significantly different from the firm's own past or its key competitors or the industry as a whole. Now, we will discuss the resource-based view of the firm. Apple and Samsung are two strong competitors in the mobile market, but Apple is the clear winner. Why? Analysts cite Apple's superiority over Samsung in its innovative capabilities. Apple's focus on innovation has helped it to maintain a competitive edge over its rival Samsung. The above example presents a typical illustration of the resource-based view of the firm. The resource-based view is a method of analyzing and identifying a firm's strategic advantages based on examining its distinct combination of assets, skills, capabilities, and tangibles as an organization. Students, in this model, we see that resources emerge as a key input to getting the superior performance by the firm. The resource-based view, also known as RBV, is a method of analyzing and identifying a firm's strategic advantage based on examining its distinct combination of assets, skills, capabilities, and intangibles as an organization. It is a model that sees resources as a key to superior performance by the company. RBV's underlying idea is based on the fact that each firm possesses a distinctive bundle of resources such as the tangible and the intangible assets and the organizational capabilities, that is the skills. Students, the firms build upon the competencies out of these resources and thus becomes the source of a firm's competitive advantage. Competitive advantage is the advantage which is gained by an organization against its competitor. A resource-based view is based on two assumptions: the heterogeneity and the immobility. The first assumption, that is the assumption of heterogeneity, is that the skills, assets and capabilities that organizations possess are different from those possessed by the others. If the organizations would have the same type and amount of resources, they will not be able to plan different strategies to outperform each other. The second assumption talks about the immobility feature of the resources. That is, the resources are not mobile and do not from organization to organization. Due to this characteristic, the organizations cannot imitate resources of their competitor. For example, the resources of Apple cannot be imitated by Samsung and vice versa. The resource-based view categorizes the organizational resources into tangible assets, intangible assets, and the organizational capabilities. Students, let us now understand each of these separately. The tangible assets. The tangible assets are the physical and financial resources which are easily identified in a company's balance sheet. They include the raw material, the financial resources, the real estate, the machinery, etc. For example, Tata Motors receives cash, so it is its resource. SpiceJet has its fleet, which is its resource. DLF has its land bank, which are its resources. These resources are the tangible assets. Then we have the intangible assets. Intangible assets are the non-physical assets that are created by managers and other employees. They are the assets which cannot be touched, which cannot be saw, but they are really very important in creating the competitive advantage for a company. These intangible assets include the brand names, the company's reputation, the organizational morale, the patents, the trademark, and the technical knowledge. For example, we have the brands such as Apple, Tata. These brands imply a reputation. These brands imply a quality. These brands imply a perception of what value the customer is going to get. These things cannot be developed in a day or two. These things evolve only after intangible assets have been invested into and somebody has really worked upon a strategy for them. The third type of the assets are the organizational capabilities. Organizational capabilities are not an input just as we have tangible or intangible assets, but they basically refer to the set of skills. It refers to a company's ability and the way to combining assets, people and processes to convert the inputs into the outputs. For example, we have a company called Google. Google is into the development process. We have Walmart. Walmart has got its capability in terms of its purchasing processes and inbound logistics. In the resource-based view, once the strategists have identified their company's tangible assets, intangible assets and the organizational capabilities, the RBV applies a set of guidelines to decide which of the identified resources will be the strengths and weaknesses for the company. The resource-based view provides the following set of 4 guidelines. Firstly, are the resources important to be able to meet a customer's needs better than the competitors? Resources that contribute to competitive advantage of an organization are more valuable as compared to those which do not. For example, we have a brand called Starbucks, which is very easily recognized. Hence, the brand is an important resource for this. Second point is, are the resources scarce? When a resource is scarce, it is more valuable and it becomes a basis for competitive advantage. For example, a company which possesses limited natural resources will have exclusive access to those resources and hence this resource will become its competitive advantage. Third thing is, are the resources durable and sustainable over time? The slower a resource depreciates, the more valuable it is. Durability is a vital asset of value for an organization's key resources. For example, Pepsi has a brand name and this brand name has continued to appreciate. Fourthly, are the resources necessary for a key share of a company's profits? Companies generate sizable amount of the profits based on the resources such as skills and contacts. For example, consulting businesses earn substantial profits from their skilled personnel. The objective for strategists is to identify the valuable resources after applying the above set of principles. So the students, strategists should then build the organizational competitive advantage on the basis of these valuable resources. Now, let us throw some light on the resource-based allocation decision. In strategic planning, a resource allocation decision is a plan for using available resources to achieve the company's goals in future. It is the process of allocating resources amongst various projects and business units. The plan has 2 main parts. The first part is the basic allocation decisions and secondly the contingency mechanisms. Basic allocation decision is the choice of which items to fund in a plan and the level of fundings the items will receive, whereas contingency mechanism is used to rank the items both included and excluded from the plan to ascertain which items to include in the plan if more resources become available and which one to be excluded or sacrificed if the funds are reduced. Strategic management enables resources to be allocated according to the importance established by the annual objectives. Allocation of the resources to particular divisions and departments does not imply that a company strategy will be implemented successfully. Number of factors can hinder the resource allocation process. For instance, the overprotection of the resources, greater emphasis on short-run financial criteria, organizational politics, vague strategic targets, risk aversion, and also lack of the sufficient knowledge. So with this background, students, now let us focus on the factors which influence the resource allocation. Resource allocation is not an easy task. Resource allocation to different functions and activities depends upon many factors which have been discussed as, firstly, the objectives or the goals. Allocation of resources depends upon the objectives set by the company. There are a number of objectives which can be explicit as well as implicit. Resource allocation should be directed towards achievement of the objectives. Objectives direct the course of action taken by the management after prioritizing the objectives. For example, the management wants to maximize the shareholders' return. The financial resources, that is the profits, will have to be distributed to the shareholders rather than being retained as reserves. Managerial preferences, dominance of top management in strategy formulation and implementation also influences the resource allocation. More often, the senior management, such as the chief executive officer, tend to affect the process of resource allocation. Projects which are likely to generate substantial profits, for them there are more resources which are allocated as compared to the ones which are perceived to generate less profits. The external factors. The external factors include various stakeholders. Stakeholders such as governments, suppliers, shareholders, employees, customers, bankers, and the communities. So students, these different stakeholders also influence the resource allocation. For example, financial institutions may ask the companies to invest in technology upgradation. Environmental regulators may impose the environmental restrictions, and similarly say there could be issues related to greenhouse emission, and investment of decisions would be influenced by the policy on energy conservation, etc. The fourth set of factors are the internal factors. Resources are synonymous with power. Internal policies based on negotiations affect the resource allocation. Some department heads get more funds for their department due to their power or influence upon the top management. They are in good terms with them. For example, finance department can obtain more funds than the marketing department just because they have more access to internal negotiations and better bargaining with the management. Fifthly, it's the nature of the strategies which also influences the resource allocation. Some strategies require more inputs in terms of capital, human resources, whereas some strategies may need lesser inputs in terms of, say, the human resources or funds, etc. Accordingly, resources are allocated depending upon the requirement of the strategy. For example, if a firm plans to develop and design a new product, it will require much more resources as compared to taking a routine marketing decision related to the product. It's also the availability of resources which is very important. So students, if a firm is in a position to procure more funds or has substantial funds, that resources can be allocated to various activities. But if a firm has limited funds and the resources are not available to it, then it will have to prioritize and it will have to do some kind of ranking. Only then it will be able to allocate the resources. So students, let us now move on and study the problems in resource allocation. Since resource allocation is a very complex process, it creates difficulties for the strategists to allocate resources to the tasks for fulfillment of the objectives. The following are the difficulties which the strategists encounter while allocating the resources. The first difficulty is the lack of resources. A major hurdle to efficient allocation of the resources is the lack of the resources. There can be a dearth of resources such as the financial resources, the physical resources, and the human resources, which could be difficult to find. The companies face problems in procuring finance at a reasonable cost of the capital. Similarly, capital goods, skilled human resources, they all are scarce. In developing country like India, many capital goods have to be imported, placing a burden on the firm's finances as well as foreign exchange. Limitations to generating resources. there can be several difficulties during allocation of resources within the organization. There can be restrictions on generating resources for newer units or departments that require urgent need for resources mostly. This usually occurs in the government departments, the government supported undertakings, where the usual way of allocation is a fixed percentage increase over last year's budget, irrespective of the current need or the growth potential of the department. The third problem is the overstatement of the need. The overstatement of the need is a very common phenomenon, as the resource allocation is often overstated by the powerful units in the departments or the organizations. The budgeting department faces problems in efficient allocation of the resources due to the vested interests of the people who are dominating. The fourth problem is the tendency to imitate the competitors. So students, usually organizations in the same industry tend to imitate their competitors in terms of resource allocation. It becomes difficult for the companies to develop their own competitive advantage if different companies following different strategies have same resource allocation process. So with this background, now students, we will recapitulate what we have learned so far. First, we have learned is it's very important for an organization to manage and allocate the resources effectively, as it improves the performance of the business, increases profit and the reputation of the firm. We have also learned the scanning of internal environment, which provides valuable insights about the strengths and weaknesses of a firm. It helps in identification of the key resources. We have also learned that resources are of different types, and they include physical, financial, human and the technical resources. We have also studied that resource allocation is a process of allocating key resources to the activities of the firm, and how to allocate, how much to allocate to various activities and various departments. A firm has to align the resource allocation strategy to gain the competitive advantage in the long run. We have also learned that the resource-based view of the firm argues that organizations which possesses resources that facilitates them to create competitive advantage, and this competitive advantage gives them a superior performance vis-a-vis the competitors. Resources have to be continuously developed due to the development of technology and changes in the competition levels to secure sustainable competitive advantage. We have also studied that resource allocation decisions is a process of allocating available resources amongst various projects, the business units, so that we can achieve the firm's goals in future. The plan has two parts: the basic resource allocation decisions and the contingency mechanisms. We also studied the factors that affect resource allocation, which are the objectives of the firm, the internal policy, the external factors, the availability of resources, managerial preferences, and also the nature of the strategy. The difficulty in the process of resource allocation arises due to lack of resources, limitation on generating resources, overstatement of the need, the tendency of the competitors to imitate the resource allocation process. As a chief executive officer of a firm, there is an important role which has to be played in the resource allocation process. He has to allocate the resources in consultation with all the executives and create a favorable environment so that resource allocation decisions are taken in agreement with all the departments.